God's been God a long time, but on the way to the top, God's rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. God's made many enemies, and somebody got pissed. Somebody's not happy. And now, what do you know? God is dead. I'm Larry Charles, and I want to know, who killed God?
A familiar refrain we hear throughout history when it comes to unsolved crimes, or even crimes where a patsy has been convicted, is, "Where are the witnesses? Show us a witness." Well, you know what? There are witnesses to every major crime in history. From Jesus to Caesar to Lincoln to Gandhi to the Kennedys and Martin Luther King, all of those killings were witnessed by somebody. Sometimes the murderer or murderers are the only witnesses, but sometimes, like Lee Harvey Oswald or James Earl Ray or Sirhan Sirhan, the patsy is the primary witness, thrust knowingly or unknowingly into the middle of the action to take the onus off the real perpetrators, and then either killed themselves or their claims of innocence or conspiracy scoffed and dismissed, or hypnotized like the Manchurian Candidate, only to snap out of it later after the crime. And if you start thinking about our fragile psyches and how easy it is to manipulate our thoughts, and you know the history of MK Ultra and their drug-fueled brainwashing experiments, how do we know if what we're seeing is actually even what we're seeing? We fool ourselves into believing we see reality, but there is much force exerted to present us a false version of reality. This leaves the concept of witnessing, like much quasi-science in the pursuit of criminal justice, to be less than reliable and, in fact, of dubious credibility. Whether we believe what we see right before our eyes or not doesn't make it real. If these major crimes in history were covered up or falsely solved to suppress any further inquiry, then imagine the magnitude of manipulation in the wake of the killing of God. Would there be any technique not utilized to deceive the public about the truth? The truth being that God has been murdered by evil forces. And I don't mean in a comic book or superhero movie, I mean for real, here in this world right now. I guess that depends on your definition of God and your definition of real. Because this crime could have taken place a millennia ago or yesterday, is there a statute of limitations on the killing of God? When it comes to God, doesn't the concept of time become irrelevant? Maybe it's taken thousands of human Earth years to kill God. Or has there even been any crime at all? Or is there even a God? We're told not to bear false witness against God, but those are just empty words. The Bible, world history, politics, war, sexual hypocrisy, human subjugation, humans constantly bear false witness. There are humans who purposely and knowingly bear false witness, but there are those that believe what they're saying is the truth, but they're wrong, and they are unwillingly bearing false witness and mistakenly believing that they're right. And there are those who are so manipulated and under a spell that they will testify to and support any outlandish fabrication that keeps the agenda on track without even realizing it. Listen to the people who believe JFK Jr. is still alive. They're convinced, and you can see how and why that would confirm and make sense of their worldview and provide solace and comfort in a mad, chaotic, godless cosmos. I mean, it would be pretty amazing if he was alive and emerged now and confirmed all this madness. It's not all that different than believing Jesus rose from the dead like a zombie, because fear of death is such a driving force in our psyche. How comforting it is to believe that nothing ever really truly dies. So you could see how those with the resources would be motivated to get you to believe magical thinking and the many methods they have at their disposal to accomplish this. They made us believe God was real in the first place because that furthered their agenda. But now, God stands in the way of their agenda, so they want us to believe God is alive, so we can believe God somehow mysteriously approves of their evil actions in ways we as humans simply can't understand. When in reality, God is dead. They've killed God, and they exploit the chaos while the rest of us are expected to pray for the solution and be satisfied by those futile exhortations to a dead God, a murdered God, while the earth and heavens and everything falls apart. Maybe things are supposed to fall apart. We don't really know. The universe expands and contracts. Who knows how many times and in how many forms this has occurred? And we don't really even know if man accelerating the destruction isn't part of the plan. But the fact that a small group profits from it should raise suspicions. If this small, powerful group was altruistic, wouldn't they use their resources to make it better, not make it worse more quickly? There's nothing natural or predestined about it. They have used their power unimpeded with God out of the way to intervene and change the course of our reality. The irony is that we will ask the killers of God to swear an oath to God to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But if that system worked, if people only told the truth under oath and believed they'd really get into trouble for lying, we wouldn't need perjury laws. But perjury laws are for you and me, not the people in charge. We see the powerful lying under oath constantly, with impunity, because again, ultimately, the perjury law in essence doesn't exist if it's not enforced. So being a witness to the killing of God is a dangerous and precarious position to be in. You have a mark on your head, not the mark of Cain. That's another lie. Cain gets a mark on his head, but gets away with the murder of his brother Abel, who is not saved or resurrected, even though God could have done that. No, Cain goes out and procreates across the earth. Abel, the good, is forgotten, while everyone knows Cain. Maybe that explains all the evil in the world. We are all Cain's children. It's the lesson those that have killed God live by. Commit a murder and get away with it. In fact, prosper and thrive because of it. And just being a truthful witness isn't enough. Will you be believed? Will you even be listened to? Let's ask Anita Hill, or Kato Kalin, or the children who were raped by Michael Jackson, or Alexander Vindman and Trump's impeachment witnesses, or even UFO witnesses. I mean, who gets made more fun of than UFO witnesses? But we know these famous witnesses told us what happened and weren't believed. And in most cases, if they did get their version of events out there, they were ruined and destroyed for telling us what they saw. And when it comes to judging the credibility of witnesses, are those that decide our credibility credible themselves? And due to the inundation of our every personal, private, and public moments of our lives, now chronicled on some sort of recording device, voluntarily or not, public executions, like the murder of JFK, are a less effective way to remove an important figure because everybody can see you. When there are dozens or even thousands of witnesses, it's a much bigger job to get rid of them. In JFK's day, there was literally only the Zapruder film, and as the motorcade passes Dealey Plaza and the crime occurs, much of it is blocked by a road sign. Well, that's not completely true. There is at least one more home movie, and who knows what news footage, and thousands of stills that were confiscated by authorities and never seen again. Why? We know why. Because it would prove something that they don't want proven. Today, you'd see the crime not only committed in real time, but even the setup to the crime and the aftermath would be covered by various gas station cameras and parking lot cameras and convenience store cameras and multiple bystanders with cell phones from every conceivable angle. It would be impossible to confiscate all that footage. Of course, we assume all these cameras are always working, and yet we learn again and again that these cameras are mysteriously not working when an actual crime is committed. Like the recent subway shooting in Brooklyn or the jailhouse murder of Jeffrey Epstein. Is that general ineptitude and incompetence? Or is that purposeful? Or are perpetrators simply able to take advantage of and capitalize on the society's ineptitude and incompetence? So death must be administered in new ways. Murder must be committed in new ways, embracing the new technology. First there was our bare hands, then sharp objects and blunt objects, then guns, then bigger and faster guns, then bombs that can destroy the world. But the technology works the other way too. Things get bigger and more modern, but they also get much smaller and intimate and handmade, like Putin's or Kim Jong-un's poisoning of rivals and dissidents by blowing poison in their face as they pass them on the street. Or the obvious conspiracy to murder Jeffrey Epstein, which really ingeniously incorporates large and small, old and new murder technology at the same time, where there are no witnesses and mysteriously the camera wasn't working either. That's another way to embrace the technology to get away with murder. Have the new technology at your disposal, control the technology, and then say, oh, it wasn't working. What are we supposed to say? This is another issue with modern witnessing. If it's not on camera, it doesn't exist. If it's not on camera, you as a witness cannot prove that you saw what you purported to see, even if what you saw was real. Having things be both new technology as our savior and you can't trust new technology is the ultimate exploitation of the technology of power and control because it sows the seeds of maximum confusion. You could see how any of these scenarios would benefit the murderers of God. But let's assume for a moment that God was killed during the tens of thousands of years before cameras. This brings us to the discussion of the reliable witness. Look at the Bible. It's full of outlandish lies and purposeful fabrications to further an agenda, but they're characterized as witness testimony. So many delusional believers will say, well, Paul said it, well, John said it. Well, we don't even know if Paul, John, or Jesus even existed, or when. If Paul existed, he might have been born over a century after the time of Christ, if that time ever existed. When you read about the gospel writers, it's always in the context of them being born 50, 100 years after Christ. But there is no proof that Christ existed, so how unreliable is that measurement? It's just made up. It sounds real because it's been ingrained into us, into our very DNA since we were babies and even before, and backed up with false evidence. And we don't know anything but to believe it. And even as we grow up, when we start to doubt, we are judged and criticized and often shunned for questioning a lie. You see what I'm saying? It's all very precarious. Believing what you've seen is true is not the same thing as seeing things accurately. Murder is not merely a violent act, but it can only thrive amidst a symphony of sophistry. And what's the difference if someone actually witnessed the murder of God back in the Bible days? There's no record, written, oral, nothing. Or if there was, it was destroyed, purposely or with the knowledge that time itself would destroy any record. So it doesn't matter. These witnesses are long, long dead. They're so dead that the places they lived don't even exist anymore. We know there were many books thrown out of the official canon of the Bible because they were too controversial or didn't follow the accepted, strict, rigid, narrow gospel of the church version of events. I mean, how do we know there is no lost book of the Bible called Who Killed God? And think about how many paintings and drawings have been lost to time. Did Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci do a painting entitled Who Killed God? How would we know? We don't even really know if the Mona Lisa was real. And another problem is the preponderance of forgeries, both in documents like the Dead Sea Scrolls and in paintings. There's big money behind forgeries, and where there's big money, there are powerful, unseen forces manipulating events for their own profit and control. They want us, the public, the outraged and angry, to be perpetually confused, to never be sure, never be completely certain of the truth, to render the truth meaningless, and that's the way they've wanted it since the beginning of recorded time. Rashomon is a Japanese movie by Akira Kurosawa about a killing as witnessed from many different perspectives and how wildly different those perspectives are. Is the truth a synthesis of those perspectives or something outside those perspectives? But it reveals a profound truth about humans. We can't agree on anything, and even though we may think we know a lot, we don't know everything and we may not know anything. We can all stare at the same thing and see something different. In Rashomon, the murdered samurai speaks through a psychic. Wouldn't it be great if psychics and clairvoyants and channelers were real, so that God could speak to us from the great beyond? Or has God always been in the great beyond? Is heaven the great beyond? We're told God is waiting for us in heaven. Wouldn't that make heaven a place for the dead? And thus, if God's there, isn't God dead too? We don't know what happened before recorded history, but we learn every day that there are not only pre-civilizations in prehistory, but pre-pre-civilizations in pre-prehistory. And as we learn more, we forget more too. And so who knows what craziness was going on back then? What we don't know is much greater and far more vast than what we do. Maybe man was fucking dinosaurs. Maybe we are the reptile progeny of that union. Maybe the reptilian agenda is real. Isn't it possible that the serpent fucked Eve? Just because there's no proof doesn't mean it didn't happen. So we have to consider the idea that God has been absent, has not been with us, has been dead since the beginning of recorded history. And in fact, perhaps recorded history begins with the killing of God. So the myth of God could be perpetrated to achieve a certain end. The amoral and immoral control and exploitation of humans, animals, the planet, and as we now see, the cosmos themselves, while the real God, who would never have approved if we believed God was benign and benevolent and living, was actually long dead. Maybe the Bible itself is an elaborate cover-up. God did this and God did that. Meanwhile, the actual God's floating in space somewhere like an astronaut that's had their line cut. And if it is an elaborate smokescreen to pretend God is alive, it worked like a charm. No one ever suspected that this God that we keep reading about, that dominates civilizations, actually doesn't exist. Either because God was made up in the first place, or because if God is real, God has been murdered. We must accept the concept of God as the greatest long-running mass hallucination of all time. So we must abandon the idea of witnesses that predate recorded history. We must accept the idea that many generations of God's killer or killers have come and gone with impunity, spreading their poison and using God as a cover. But what if this is a modern crime, a contemporary crime, committed right under our noses, but simply ignored? Well, we've talked about the high-profile murder of prominent people, how powerful forces conspired successfully to end these lives which were a threat to the corrupt status quo. And the questions remain and are still being asked to this day in books, movies, and YouTube videos like this. But what if the killing of God is more like the hundreds or thousands of indigenous women here in Canada and Mexico who mysteriously disappear every year without a trace? Other than the grieving families who want answers, the level of apathy, the lack of curiosity by the public, the authorities, is astounding. Why? Because the answer is an uncomfortable truth. The powerful are the serial killers, destroying life without consequences. They're either laughing at us or killing us. This ensures that the only witnesses to these crimes are tragically the victims themselves. The authorities don't follow up, or don't care, or are inept, or don't even acknowledge a crime has occurred. If the authorities don't even acknowledge that a crime has occurred, then it can't be solved because it didn't happen, even if it did. And you are a witness to nothing. So contemplate that for a moment. What if God was killed and nobody cared? God has no family. Remember, God killed his only begotten son. The priests and nuns and bishops and cardinals and pope, are they God's family? What is religion but distortions and confusions and lies about reality? The clergy have made a lifelong commitment to this lie. Their only job is to cover up and gloss over the truth about God, whether it be his, hers, they, its incomprehensible, unspeakable evil deeds committed by God, or in the name of God, or to God. And what if God was killed and no one in a position of authority even acknowledged it? If nobody cares about the murder of God, how do you get anyone to care about the thousands of nameless John and Jane Does rotting in morgues around the world, or lying in fields or at the bottom of lakes decomposing, never to be found? Ask yourself, what if someone you loved disappeared or was killed, and nobody in a position of authority seemed to care? Moreover, these very same authorities are indebted and beholden to those who wish to cover up the crime and make it disappear. What would you do? That's how murderers get away with murder. The killing of God is not even taken seriously, and that's how they want you to feel. We even make jokes about it like they do about the JFK murder. They make TV shows like Lucifer or Supernatural, which trivializes God while making Satan the hero. How did that happen? Why is that okay? Reduce the whole thing, scoff at its significance, and make you feel like a fool for caring. That's one way the perpetrators guarantee they'll get away with it. If no one cares, there's no motivation to solve the crime. But it makes you wonder other things as well. Are we so limited by our human imagination at this stage of evolution that we simply can't conceive of things on this magnitude? And that concerted effort to make us apathetic is crucial to their success. That's why caring is so important. It's one of the few weapons we have to fight the evil without conscience that engulfs us. I mean, Satan purportedly works for God. Satan was a fallen angel. But what if that's all bullshit? What if Satan is the fall guy? Or what if God is Satan? Now, a rational, enlightened person says that God is a metaphor, not a real person, that there is no body. God doesn't live or die. There is no cause of death. I don't know whether to scoff or realize they are right. Because if I know anything about the killing of God, I know that being reasoned and rational and logical would not help solve this case. So how reliable a witness can any of us ever hope to be? Which brings us back to the concept of witnessing. Either the witnesses were unreliable, or refusing to talk, or self-incriminate, or scared. But ultimately, nobody saw nothing. So yes, of course it would be great to have witnesses to the ultimate crime. But as we now know, the witnesses could be dead or killed, lying or wrong, refusing to talk or self-incriminate, or just scared. Or there just may be no witnesses at all. That's why it's so important to remember, no evidence and no witnesses does not mean no crime. When you think of the hundreds of people who witnessed the JFK assassination, or the RFK assassination, or even the death of Jesus, you realize there is either no record of their testimony because they weren't interviewed, or their interviews were discarded or discounted. We see how the reliance on witnesses is simply a way for the powers that be, the establishment, the ruling elite, the guilty, to prevent us from seeing and knowing the truth and retaining control of their corrupt, false narrative. The reliance on witnesses and evidence, and then the lack of witnesses and evidence by their own narrow criteria, is a perfect system to maintain and protect the status quo, the guilty parties. We believe who and what we want, and if it doesn't exist, we suppress it until that information is either rendered unreliable or simply non-existent. How convenient. So I reject the very concept of witnesses. What if we stop looking for witnesses to the killing of God and instead look to the consequences of the killing of God? No one may have witnessed the killing of God, but we all witness the consequences of killing God. All around us, everywhere, every moment of every day. War, disease, crime, cruelty, destroying the planet. Why would God have wanted to create this shitty world filled with bad people with bad intentions who control everything and distract us from the truth? That doesn't make sense. So if you believe God is alive, ask yourself why he, she, them, they, it would be okay with that And you have to follow that with, if God is okay with a world of suffering, God is really a shitty, fucked up God. Or God sucks at being God. Maybe God's not that good at being God. Maybe God's in over his, her, them, they, its head. Maybe God needs to be fired. But if you don't believe God is okay with all this, and that these things happening all around is the proof, is the evidence of the death of God, and we see it clearly even when we turn our heads and don't want to, then aren't we all witnesses? We play by the rules they set, but they don't. God is dead. The greatest crime ever committed in the universe, not just of all time, but from before time even existed. Yet no evidence, no witnesses, no body, but lots and lots of suspects. Suspects can be witnesses. Suspects can have evidence. Time is running out on our fate and the world and the universe, unless time, death, and God are all illusions. When you think of us as witnesses to the killing of God, then you realize the list of suspects is endless. In part 6 of Who Killed God, we will review the list. We will examine and analyze those with the most to gain from the crime. We will ask the 3 fundamental questions of a crime. That will allow us to hone in on the suspect list. Who has motive, who has means, and who has opportunity? And we will be forced to realize and reckon with the disturbing and overwhelming revelation that they all do. If you've seen anything, heard anything, know anything that might lead to the apprehension of the killer or killers of God, please leave your comments below, and we, again, will follow up diligently and investigate thoroughly. There is no statute of limitations on this. The ultimate crime. We won't and we shouldn't rest until we know who killed God. And please, feel free to leave any thoughts, ideas, opinions, and questions you might have in the comments section. And if you have nothing better to do, subscribe to my channel, Larry Charles Projects. Unlike almost everything else these days, it's free.